Ladies and gentlemen, when someone cuts everyone off, people love to call it cold, dramatic, or random. But psychology tells a different story, because human beings do not detach for fun. They detach when staying connected starts costing them their peace, their identity, their self-respect, and their nervous system. So if someone disappeared, stopped answering, unfollowed, removed people, went silent, and chose isolation, it usually wasn't a sudden mood. It was the end of a long emotional war they were fighting quietly, because before people cut everyone off, they usually try, they explain, they forgive, they give chances, they tolerate disrespect, they swallow disappointment, and they keep hoping someone will finally understand them. But hope, without change, becomes self-betrayal, and once a person realizes they are repeatedly hurting themselves by staying available to people who don't value them, something inside them snaps, not in anger, but in clarity, and that clarity is dangerous, because it removes the need to negotiate their worth. When someone cuts people off, the outside world loves to label it as sudden, cold, or random, but most of the time it is none of those things. It is a decision that was forming quietly for a long time, like pressure building inside a sealed container until the lid finally lifts. People rarely detach on the first disappointment. They detach after the same disappointment repeats so many times that the mind stops calling it bad day and starts calling it pattern. Before the cutoff happens, there is usually a long season of trying, and this is the part nobody sees. The person stays, explains, gives chances, communicates their needs, forgives what shouldn't have been repeated, tolerates what keeps hurting them, and keeps hoping that, if they love correctly, the other person will finally respond correctly. They tell themselves, maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe they're stressed. Maybe if I'm more patient, they'll change. And they keep shrinking their standards just to keep the connection alive. They do emotional labor that looks like loyalty, but feels like exhaustion. Over time, something dangerous happens inside them, not anger, but awareness. They start collecting evidence, not in a petty way, but in a survival way. They notice who reaches out only when they need something. They notice who disappears when it's time to show support. They notice who listens, but never hears. They notice the subtle disrespect, the inconsistency, the broken promises, the jokes that sting, the boundaries that get ignored, the apologies that never come, the effort that is always one-sided. They watch themselves keep giving, and they watch the other person keep taking, and slowly the mind realizes, this connection is costing me more than it's giving me. And here is the core psychological moment. Hope without change becomes self-betrayal. At first, hope feels noble. It feels like loyalty. It feels like having a good heart. But if nothing improves, hope turns into a quiet form of harm, because it keeps you in a place where you repeatedly abandon your own needs. The person begins to feel split inside. One side still wants the relationship to work, and the other side feels disgusted with how much they've accepted. That internal conflict is painful. And eventually the mind chooses one path to end the pain: clarity. Clarity is not loud, clarity is cold and clean. It doesn't argue, it doesn't beg, it doesn't scream. It simply says, I can't do this anymore. It's the moment they stop negotiating their worth. It's the moment they stop trying to convince people to care. It's the moment they accept the truth they didn't want to accept, that some people won't change, not because you didn't explain it well, but because they benefit from staying the same. They benefit from your forgiveness, your availability, your softness, your second chances. They benefit from you staying emotionally present while they remain emotionally careless. So the cutoff, when it finally happens, feels sudden to everyone else, because everyone else only sees the last chapter. They didn't see the nights of overthinking. They didn't see the silent disappointment after being ignored again. They didn't see the internal conversations. Should I speak up again? Or will I look needy? Should I distance myself, or am I being dramatic? Do they actually care? Or do they just like access to me? They didn't see the person slowly losing their spark, losing their trust, losing their willingness to keep explaining what should be obvious. The cutoff is often not an emotional explosion, it's emotional numbness after too many small wounds. It's when the person stops feeling safe, stops feeling respected, stops feeling valued, and starts feeling like they are constantly paying to stay connected. And when the mind realizes that a relationship has become a recurring cost, it looks for a way to stop the bleeding. For some people, that way is a boundary. For others, it's a full reset. This is why it wasn't random, it was the final step in a long sequence. It was the moment they chose peace over proximity. It was the moment they decided that being alone is less painful than being repeatedly disappointed by people who keep showing you, through behavior, that you are not a priority. It was the moment they stopped romanticizing potential and started respecting reality. Emotional debt is what happens when a relationship keeps taking from you, but rarely pays you back, and the most dangerous part is that it doesn't feel dramatic at first. It feels normal. It feels like, this is what love looks like. This is what friendship is. This is what being a good person means. Until one day you realize you have been bleeding slowly for a very long time. People think cutting others off comes from hatred, but often it comes from a quiet financial collapse of the heart. You gave, and the account never refilled. At the beginning, you don't track it. You excuse it. You tell yourself, they're busy. They're stressed. They're not good at communication. They didn't mean it. And because you have empathy, you protect their image in your own mind. You become the translator of their neglect, the lawyer defending them against your own pain. You keep showing up, answering quickly, listening deeply, helping repeatedly, forgiving easily, and you believe that if you keep being consistent, they will eventually meet you there. But emotional debt doesn't disappear, it accumulates. It builds up in small moments, the time you needed support and they vanished, the time you were excited and they minimized it, the time you were hurting and they changed the subject, the time you set a boundary and they treated you like the problem, the time you communicated clearly and they still did the same thing again. These moments may look small from the outside, but to the nervous system they are data, and the nervous system learns through repeated experience, not through words. So eventually the mind begins to connect a pattern. Every time I stay close, I feel drained. Every time I reach out, I feel rejected. Every time I give, I feel used. Every time I open up, I feel unsafe. This is not overthinking, this is pattern recognition. And once the brain recognizes a pattern of emotional loss, it starts to protect you. This is where most people misunderstand the person who pulls away. They think the person is being dramatic, but the person is simply tired of paying for closeness. Because closeness should not feel like a constant sacrifice of self. Healthy relationships refill you, not just because they give you gifts or compliments, but because there is reciprocity, there is care, there is effort, there is mutual responsibility. When that reciprocity is missing, you become the emotional bank, always depositing, always covering the cost, always forgiving the overdraft while the other person takes without noticing, or worse, takes while expecting more. And here's the psychological trap. The more you invest, the harder it is to leave, because your brain starts thinking, if I walk away now, everything I gave was wasted. So you keep giving, hoping that one day the relationship will finally become what you imagined. You don't just stay attached to the person, you stay attached to the future you pictured with them. You stay attached to potential. You stay attached to the fantasy that effort will be rewarded. But then something shifts. The emotional debt becomes too heavy. You start waking up tired, not physically, but emotionally. Your patience shortens. Your joy dims. You feel resentment creeping in, even when you don't want it to. You become hyper, aware of imbalance. You notice how quickly they ask for your time, but how slowly they return it. You notice how they remember their needs, but forget yours. You notice how they can disappear for days, then return with demands, like nothing happened, like your feelings are optional. This is where distance becomes safety. Not because you hate them, but because your nervous system cannot keep absorbing the inconsistency. When the brain connects closeness with pain, it automatically begins to associate distance with relief. Relief is addictive too, but it's a healthier addiction than misery. The person pulling away isn't trying to punish anyone. They're trying to regulate themselves. They're trying to stop the emotional bleeding they kept calling love. And that's why, when they finally cut people off, it looks extreme, but it isn't. It's the last resort after many small attempts failed. Often they tried boundaries, they tried communication, they tried patience, they tried lowering expectations, they tried being understanding. But each time they adjusted, the other person stayed the same. So eventually they realize a hard truth. You cannot build closeness with someone who benefits from your over-giving. You cannot keep paying emotional bills for someone who never contributes. You cannot heal in the same environment that keeps harming you. Emotional debt ends the day the person decides, I would rather be alone than be constantly drained. That decision doesn't come from a random mood. It comes from a long season of imbalance that finally reached its limit. What most people misunderstand about cutting everyone off is that it often isn't fueled by hate. It's fueled by grief, and grief is not always loud. Grief is often quiet, private, and strangely calm on the outside. When a person withdraws completely, they are frequently not running from people. They are burying a fantasy, the fantasy that, if I stay patient, they'll finally understand me. The fantasy that, if I love harder, they'll finally value me. The fantasy that, if I explain it one more time, they'll finally change. That fantasy becomes an emotional home. It becomes a reason to tolerate disrespect, inconsistency, and neglect, because as long as potential exists, the pain feels temporary. But when potential dies, the mind has to face reality, and reality can feel like a loss, even if the relationship was hurting you. This is why some cutoffs look cold, because the person isn't cold, they are numb from mourning. They have cried, questioned themselves, replayed conversations, tried different approaches, blamed themselves, lowered their expectations, and waited, and waited, and waited. They have done the invisible work of grief while still staying connected, which means by the time they finally leave, their tears are already spent. To everyone else it looks sudden, but inside them, the goodbye happened slowly, in hundreds of small disappointments. The last message you didn't answer wasn't the first wound. It was the final proof that the story they were holding onto was no longer real. Psychologically, this is the moment where cognitive dissonance collapses. Cognitive dissonance is what you feel when your mind is holding two opposing truths at the same time. This person cares about me, and this person keeps hurting me. To reduce that discomfort, the mind creates explanations. It protects the fantasy. They didn't mean it. They're just stressed. They'll grow. They're not good with emotions. I'm asking for too much. If I'm more understanding, it will get better. That's not stupidity, that's attachment. Attachment makes you loyal to hope, even when hope is expensive. But the cost keeps rising, and eventually the mind can't keep lying to itself without breaking. So the person begins to grieve, not only the relationship, but the version of themselves they were inside it. They grieve the self who kept trying, the self who stayed soft, the self who believed words more than patterns, the self who thought effort would be met with effort. They grieve the time they invested, the energy they gave, the trust they offered, and the future they imagined. Because many people aren't attached to the present relationship, they're attached to the dream of what it could become, the someday version, the healed version, the mature version, the safe version. And when they finally accept that the present is the truth, not the potential, it feels like a death. This is where the cutoff becomes a funeral, not for the person alone, but for the fantasy that kept the person staying. And grief has stages: denial, bargaining, anger, sadness, acceptance. Bargaining is especially common. If I do this differently, maybe they'll respond differently. If I give them space, maybe they'll come back. If I stop complaining, maybe we'll be okay. Bargaining is the mind's attempt to maintain control, because accepting the truth feels powerless. But after enough cycles, acceptance arrives, and acceptance is not dramatic, it is clean. It says, I can't keep bleeding for something that refuses to heal. Another layer of this grief is humiliation, the quiet kind. Not the humiliation of being publicly embarrassed, but the internal humiliation of realizing how much you accepted, how long you waited, how many times you ignored your own intuition. That realization can sting more than the other person's behavior, because it forces you to confront a painful truth. I abandoned myself to keep them. When that truth lands, the mind often overcorrects. It doesn't just create a boundary, it creates distance, because distance feels like safety. The cutoff is the brain trying to prevent you from returning to the same emotional trap, the same bargaining, the same hope that turns into self-betrayal. And this is why the person who cuts everyone off can seem different. They are different. Grief changed them. When you lose a fantasy, you lose the part of you that depended on it. You become more selective, more private, more cautious with your heart, not because you hate people, but because you finally learned what it costs to love without limits. The cutoff is often the first time they choose truth over attachment, reality over potential, peace over the endless attempt to be understood by people who benefit from misunderstanding them. Identity erosion is one of the most invisible reasons people cut everyone off, Because it doesn't happen in one big moment, it happens in small daily compromises that slowly rewrite who you are. You don't wake up and decide to lose yourself. You lose yourself by adapting, by shrinking, by staying quiet, by tolerating what you shouldn't, by becoming easy. So people don't leave, by becoming strong, so people don't have to care. And the worst part is, it often looks like love from the outside, but inside it feels like self-betrayal. It begins with little things. You notice a comment that stings, but you laugh it off to keep the mood light. You feel disrespected, but you tell yourself, it's not that deep. You speak up once, but you're met with defensiveness, sarcasm, or silence, so you decide it's safer to stay quiet next time. You set a boundary, but it gets ignored, so you lower it. You ask for effort, but you're treated like you're demanding too much, so you start asking for less. This is how identity starts fading, not by force, but by repeated self-editing. Over time, you start walking on eggshells. You think before you speak, not because you're thoughtful, but because you're afraid of backlash. You become hyper, aware of other people's moods, because you've learned that your peace depends on keeping them comfortable. You stop sharing your real opinions, because you don't want conflict. You stop sharing your real needs, because you don't want to seem needy. You stop showing your real emotions, because you don't want to be too much. And slowly you become a version of yourself that is optimized for survival, not for authenticity. This is identity erosion, when your personality becomes a strategy, not an expression. When your kindness becomes a shield, when your silence becomes a habit, when your laughter becomes a mask, when you're present, but not fully yourself. And the mind keeps doing it because it believes it's protecting you. If I keep the peace, I'll keep the connection. If I don't upset them, they'll stay. If I'm low maintenance, I'll be loved. But the price of that strategy is brutal. You are trading yourself for belonging. Then comes the exhaustion, because you can't perform a version of yourself forever without feeling drained. You start feeling tired after conversations, not because you talked a lot, but because you were monitoring yourself the whole time. You start feeling tense around people you used to feel safe with, because you no longer trust the space to hold the real you. You start feeling resentment, because you are giving up pieces of yourself while others don't even notice. You feel guilty for feeling resentful, so you push it down, and that pushes you further away from yourself. The breaking point often arrives quietly. It's not a dramatic argument, it's a moment of self-recognition. You catch yourself pretending, again. You catch yourself apologizing for having normal needs. You catch yourself accepting crumbs and calling it love, or loyalty, or friendship. You catch yourself minimizing your pain so you don't make others uncomfortable. You catch yourself staying in rooms where you feel smaller. And suddenly, you feel disgust, not at them, but at the version of you that kept shrinking. That disgust is actually the beginning of self-respect waking up. At that stage, solitude begins to feel safer than company, because company has been requiring self-abandonment. Being alone feels lonely, yes, but it doesn't require you to lie about how you feel. It doesn't require you to reduce your needs. It doesn't require you to perform. It doesn't require you to tolerate disrespect just to be included. So the mind starts choosing the pain of loneliness over the pain of self-betrayal, and that choice can feel extreme to others, but inside it feels like relief. This is why people cut everyone off after long periods of being dismissed, used, manipulated, or taken for granted. They are not only leaving people, they are trying to rescue themselves. They are trying to rebuild an identity that got diluted by constant adaptation. They are trying to recover their voice, their standards, their preferences, their confidence, their emotional truth. Because once you realize you have been losing yourself in the name of connection, the strongest instinct becomes, I need distance to find me again. And distance is often the first step back to identity. Not because isolation is the ultimate goal, but because space is where you can hear yourself again. Without noise, without pressure, without being shaped by other people's expectations. Space is where you can remember what you actually like, what you actually believe, what you actually need, and who you actually are when you stop performing for acceptance. Cutting everyone off can look like strength from the outside, but psychologically it's often a survival strategy first, a lifestyle choice second, because when the nervous system has been overwhelmed for too long, it stops negotiating, it starts protecting. After repeated betrayal, humiliation, manipulation, or chronic disrespect, the brain doesn't simply move on. It rewires around safety, and safety begins to mean distance. This is why some people don't just set boundaries. They disappear. They don't just limit access, they erase access, because their body has learned, through experience, that closeness equals pain. And once the body learns that association, logic alone can't undo it. In trauma psychology, this can show up as shutdown, emotional numbing, hypervigilance, or the classic push-pull pattern, wanting connection but fearing it at the same time. A person might not trust their own judgment anymore, so the mind chooses the simplest rule. No one gets in. Because that rule feels clean, it feels controllable, it feels like protection from surprise hurt. Sometimes the cutoff is not about people being bad, it's about the person's nervous system being exhausted. Because when you've been in a long season of emotional inconsistency, your body starts bracing for impact, even in normal conversations, even with people who mean well. You read tone too deeply, you anticipate rejection, you prepare for betrayal, and the body stays tense. So isolation becomes a form of relief, not because you hate everyone, but because your system finally gets to unclench. But here's the important psychological truth. Survival strategies are not the same as healing strategies. A survival strategy keeps you safe today. Healing teaches you how to stay safe without shrinking your future. Cutting everyone off can be the emergency brake. It can stop the immediate bleeding. It can give you space to breathe. But if it becomes permanent, it can also become a prison. Because the same wall that blocks danger also blocks love, support, mentorship, opportunity, and healthy intimacy. This is why the goal is not to become unreachable. The goal is to become discerning. Discernment is a higher level of emotional intelligence than isolation. Isolation says, I trust nobody. Discernment says, I trust slowly, I trust wisely, I trust based on evidence. Isolation is a blanket decision made from fear. Discernment is a calibrated decision made from clarity. The healthiest outcome after a cutoff is not, I'll never need anyone again. The healthiest outcome is, I will never abandon myself again. That means you learn to stay connected without being consumed. You learn to love without overgiving. You learn to care without collapsing your boundaries. This is where boundaries become the real power, not dramatic exits, not revenge silence, not deleting everyone to prove a point, but clear standards that protect your identity. Boundaries are how you keep your heart open without leaving it unguarded. Boundaries sound like, I'm not available for disrespect. If you cancel repeatedly, I won't keep rearranging my life. If you speak to me harshly, I'll end the conversation. If you want access to me, consistency is required. If you violate my trust, repair is required. These are not punishments, they are policies, and policies keep you from making emotional decisions in the heat of attachment. Sometimes people cut everyone off because they've never learned how to set boundaries early, so they set them late, and when boundaries come late, they come loud. They didn't say, no, at the first violation, so they had to say, never again, at the 20th. That's why healing often includes learning earlier signals. Your body tells you when something isn't safe. Your resentment tells you when something is unbalanced. Your anxiety tells you when you're overextending. Your exhaustion tells you when you're self-abandoning. When you learn to listen earlier, you don't need to explode later. There's also a deeper courage in re-entering connection carefully, because trust after pain is not rebuilt by words, it's rebuilt by repeated experiences of safety. That might mean choosing one safe person, not 10, sharing one truth, not your whole story, testing consistency over time, not rushing intimacy because you miss it. It might mean learning the difference between someone who is charming and someone who is reliable, between someone who talks nicely and someone who repairs harm, between someone who wants access and someone who respects boundaries. And yes, if the cutoff came from deep betrayal or trauma, support from a qualified professional can help you regulate your nervous system, so you don't confuse a healthy person with a dangerous one just because your body is still braced for impact. The point is, cutting everyone off is sometimes the first act of self-respect a person has ever made, but the next act of self-respect is learning how to stay in the world without losing yourself in it, learning how to choose people instead of tolerating them, learning how to be kind without being available to chaos, learning how to keep your peace without becoming emotionally extinct.